Well, welcome everyone to the Kidlit Distancing Social. I'm really excited about our guest tonight. Lyn Miller-Lachmann is going to be talking about all kinds of really interesting things, including writing historical fiction and creating inclusive characters, among many other things, because she is multi-talented. And for those of you who might be watching our social for the first time, I'm Laura Backus. I am the publisher of Children's Book Insider, the newsletter for children's writers. We are celebrating our 30th year in publication this year. Also co-creator with my husband, John, of writingblueprints.com and writeforkids.org. So if you are new to us and you want to be on our list to get announcements about the social, as well as everything else we do, you can go to writeforkids.org/ultimate-cheat sheet. You'll get on the list. You will also get a free ebook where we compile all of our best information for people who want to get started writing for children. And it's totally free, no obligation to anything. So that's a great deal. And then you'll hear about our upcoming social guests as well as other fun stuff we'll be doing. And if you're not a subscriber to CBI, but you want to be, we have a special offer just for our socialites, $5 a month, writeforkids.org/CBI. You will get our monthly newsletter, which is about 20 pages every month with market information, special above the slush pile codes that Lynn Marie, our wonderful contributor, who is listening tonight, gets for us, interviews with agents and editors who give us a special code for our subscribers where they can submit for a period of time and jump over the slush pile. And you also have access to our CBI Clubhouse, which is an online venue that goes with your subscription that has 30 years worth of information in it. So it's a good deal. So check that out. So here we go. Where in the world are you? Every week I like to know where you are, and you're sending me great pictures. So see if you can guess where this is. Ellen Tercio was in this lovely spot and took a picture for me. So you can guess in the chat box where you think this might be. And I'll give you a few clues here. This is a statue of Edna St. Vincent Millay. She was a famous poet in her day and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1923. And she and her sisters were quite the independent women in her day, known for speaking their minds. Woo. So I have some good guesses here. Savannah, Georgia, nope. Massachusetts, no, though you're getting closer. Yes, it is in Maine. Do you know where in Maine? It's a lovely place, lovely place. And I'll give you just another minute to see if you can guess. Those of you who, some of you have probably been there. Penobscot Bay. I don't know Maine well enough to know if it's on that bay or not. I need the name of the town. There's a lovely town there. Bar Harbor, no, but you're in the Kennebunkport, nope. Booth Bay Harbor, nope. You're good guesses though. I mean, all of Maine is lovely, so how could you go wrong with Maine? I will tell you where this is. Not Rockland, nope. Okay. Here we go. Camden, Maine, which is a lovely town. And I was so happy to get this picture because I was in Camden, Maine 2 years ago, this past June, with a friend. And I was walking along, there's this sort of path that goes all along the edge of the water here. And I hope you can see my cursor on the screen, but right around here, where this little dock is sticking out, I looked down in the rocks and there was a baby seal and it was stuck. It it looked like it was having trouble moving. It wanted to get up and get back in the water, but it couldn't. And I figured maybe it had gotten hit by a boat or something. So I started calling every organization I could think of to come help this seal. And as I was standing there, a lot of people gathered and we all started calling different places. And after about 45 minutes, I finally got a hold of someone, and I believe it was someone in the National Park Service, if I recall, who said, "We'll come check it out." And unfortunately, I had to leave because I had a plane to catch. So I named him Bob, and the kind people who were helping me said they would wait and make sure someone showed up. And unfortunately, I had to leave. So I really hope Bob was okay. But Camden is a lovely town. And of course, in the fall, it's even better. So I hope those of you who haven't been there get a chance to visit. Okay. So thank you, Ellen, for sending in that picture. So I want to know where you are. So take a picture of yourself in front of a literary landmark or doing some writing related thing and send it to me with a brief description of where you were and permission to use the photo, and I will feature your picture on a Kidlit Distancing Social. You can be in the picture if you want. That's great too. Mail at writeforkids.org and put "where in the world" in the subject line. So we have some great celebrations tonight, which I'm really, really excited about. So Kathy Kretchting's picture book, Sky Blue Stones, was published on September 11th by Christian Faith Publishing. And it's the story of a girl who loses something important to her and must decide if she should blame others, get angry, or show forgiveness. So congratulations, Kathy, on that. Carol Doringer, CBI subscriber and longtime attendee of the Kidlit Distancing Social, learned that a school district's STEM club for middle school and high school girls is using her nature blog and its videos to anchor some of the club's activities. And she writes that her nature posts have inspired her own writing, and she's thrilled that they're also inspiring girls' interest in natural science. And you all have to check out Carol's blog because it's really cool. It's called Tales from a West Michigan Wood at caroldoringer.com. And Carol is a very talented photographer and videographer, and she gets these great nature videos and pictures just from the area around her house. And they're fascinating. And then, of course, she researches these creatures, animals, birds, and now, most recently, spiders, and writes about them. So you learn a lot from being on her blog. So that's great, Carol. And Judith Ackerman, who's a CBI subscriber, had her self-published picture book, A Grandmother's Tin Box, featured in Book Life, which is a newsletter from Publishers Weekly that focuses on new self-published titles. And the story is about the love between a grandmother and granddaughter and the memories they create together. So congrats to you, Judith. That's awesome. And I wish you all the best of luck with these wonderful books. And Carol, I know those girls are going to be very inspired by your blog. So send me your good news. Mail at writeforkids.org and put "celebrate" in the subject line, and I will definitely feature you on a future Kidlit Distancing Social. And I see in the chat box you asked, I'm not seeing comments. I can see everybody's comments. You all can't see each other's comments. So if you want to post a comment, I will see it and I will share it if appropriate. So don't worry about that. Sharon says, thank you for not touching the seal. No, I knew enough not to go touch the seal. I just felt so bad for him. He looked like he was trying to move and he just couldn't. Okay, here's some great links of interest for this week from the publishing world. Questions you might not know to ask a literary agent is the newest video on the Bookends Literary YouTube channel. And it covers questions you should ask an agent when the agent offers you representation. So I left out the word authors there. It covers questions authors should ask an agent when the agent offers them representation. So these are things that you might not know to ask if you get this call from an agent saying, we would like to represent you, and you're going to be so excited. There are some really important things you need to ask because you're entering into a business relationship. So I created a bit.ly link that goes straight to the video, bit.ly/questions for agents. So definitely check that out if you are currently submitting to literary agents. And another great, this is a post on a website, The Futura Is Now, Why YA Cover Design Looks the Way It Does, by Kelly Jensen on the Book Riot website, discusses how book covers have evolved in the last 15 years to look good both online and on physical books. And there is the link straight to that post, bookriot.com/YA-cover-design. Now this is important if you're self-publishing and are either designing a cover yourself or having someone do it for you. There's a lot of considerations on that cover. And I can tell you, when I am scrolling through Amazon, if a cover is not done right, you immediately notice and you immediately think that is a self-published book and they didn't know what they were doing when they designed the cover. And it immediately gives you this feeling that maybe the book might not be so good either. So it's really important that your cover be spot on and also look modern. That's another problem with a lot of self-published book covers. They look old-fashioned. They look like they are from books from 30 years ago. So this is a great article. Jennifer asks, picturebooksummit.com, is that the site for tomorrow's online conference? That is this, yes, picturebooksummit.com is where you go to get information for the conference that is Saturday, October 3rd, and you can still register. So check that out, picturebooksummit.com. And it's all squished together as one word, picturebooksummit.com in the URL. Okay. All right. I'm excited to introduce my guest. So Lyn Miller-Lachmann is a writer, teacher, and sensitivity reader. She writes historical and contemporary fiction for young adults and is the editor of Once Upon a Cuento, an anthology of short stories for grades 5 and up that explores heritage, history, identity, language, and relationships from the perspective of Mexican-American, Cuban-American, Dominican-American, and Puerto Rican writers. Lyn is also fluent in Spanish and Portuguese and works as a translator for publishers. And she's traveled all over the world. And so I'm really excited to speak with her tonight about her work and how her travels have impacted her writing. So, Lyn, why don't you come on? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here.
Yes, we're very excited. So I know that when we posted on Facebook about your visit with us tonight, I got a lot of great comments from people saying, this is just what I needed to hear today. So great. We're going to touch on a lot of really, really interesting topics. So I want to start with talking about a couple of your books, your historical fiction. Sorry, I'm moving things around on my desk. Gringolandia and Surviving Santiago are both historical fiction centering around Chile's military regime that lasted from early 70s to 1990. And now your books take place in the 1980s, which a lot of authors wouldn't even consider historical fiction. But certainly for the readers, you know, who are born way beyond that, it is. So when you're writing historical fiction that might actually be set in the author's lifetime, do they still have to research it as if they would do any historical fiction, say something that took place 100 years ago? Is it still important to go back to square one and really do a lot of good research for those kinds of books?
Absolutely. I think that, you know, historical fiction, and by the way, when you say historical fiction, 9/11 is now for kids' books considered historical fiction. But yes, you have to research. I mean, it's not a memoir, it's a story, and it's someone's experience that's not necessarily your experience. And maybe you had a certain perspective on the events, but your perspective is just a narrow view.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the case of Gringolandia, I started that book as a contemporary novel in the late 1980s. I am now historical myself.
Me too.
So, but that book started when I was doing two things. One was I was a music promoter. I've done a lot of other things in my life besides writing, and one of them during the 1980s, I was a promoter of musical groups from Latin America. And some of them were living in their countries in Latin America, and some of them were living in exile because they were no longer able to stay in their countries due to dictatorships. And the other thing I was doing at the time was working with refugees from those dictatorships, and particularly families from Chile, through an organization called the Pablo Neruda Cultural Center. And it was really the stories of my friends and of the musicians who I knew that inspired Gringolandia, and then its sequel, Surviving Santiago.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a friend who, she and her husband were living in exile. They were from Chile. They left 3 years after the dictatorship because when Pinochet took over, they had provided a safe house for people being pursued by the police. And he was a professor and she was raising her young son. And they were able to get away with it for a while, but they came to realize that, you know, the net was closing in, and they were possibly going to be arrested. So that's when they fled to the United States. And at that time that I knew her, it was 10 years later. Her son was a teenager, and a rather rebellious teenager. And she and I, you know, she would kind of tell me about some of the issues she was having with him growing up, because he'd completely assimilated and did not see himself as Chilean anymore. And she told me that, you know, she said, well, why don't you write a book about us? But what I didn't tell her is at the time I was writing contemporary young adult fiction. And as a young adult writer, I was going to be taking the kids' perspective and not hers.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very much her son became the model for Danielle in Gringolandia. Somebody who has, you know, been living in the United States and assimilated and now sees himself as a US American, and in fact has not told his mother. And then when his father's suddenly released from prison, of course, his father doesn't know either, that he's already started the process of applying to become a US citizen. Mm. And that's the dilemma of the book, is that Danielle wants to be a US citizen, and he has a girlfriend and ambitions, but he also wants a relationship with his father, who he hasn't seen in almost 6 years, and a father who's been very changed by his experience of being a political prisoner. And his father, even though he's now living in safety and rejoined his family, all he wants to do is go back to Chile and continue the struggle.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating and complex topic for a book like this. Was it, you had a lot of themes going on in that book, and a lot of threads that you were weaving together. How, when you're writing a book like that, how do you plot it out? Do you plot ahead? Do you outline, or do you just write and kind of figure it out as you go?
Well, I do start with the characters. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's one of the things about historical fiction, is in terms of the research that I do, is that while I want to get a background, and I had a background, and, you know, I was writing articles for the local newspaper about the refugee community. So I already had that background that, you know, I researched it pretty much on a need to know basis. And I would start writing, and I typically do outline, not a real specific outline, but I have a general idea of, you know, who the characters are, you know, what ends up happening to them, and what they need to do to get there. So I guess on the spectrum of pantser versus plotter, I'm probably a little bit more to the plotter end,
Hmm.
but not entirely so, because I also like my characters to surprise me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in the case of that book, I started, as I said, I started writing it as a contemporary novel in the late 1980s. It won a work in progress grant from the SCBWI, which then was just SCBW. Unfortunately, I lost a contract with a publisher. And I had gotten a contract to work on a nonfiction project. And I liked the idea. I mean, after spending 3 years working on this on spec, the certainty of nonfiction, of being able to write something that's already under contract and that I know will get published, was very attractive at the time. And I didn't come back to this book until 2006. And at that point, it was a historical novel. And I ended up completely rewriting it. The only parts of the book that are from the original are the first chapter and about half of the sixth chapter.
Huh. Wow. So, as with any historical fiction, you want to give a sense to kids of the time period. Technology was non-existent back then compared to the way it is now, etc. But you don't want to point to it as like, look, they're talking on telephones where you have to push buttons, you know, instead of swipe a screen. So, and this is the I think struggle a lot of writers face when they're writing historical fiction. How much of the time period do you weave in? How much do you just leave as sort of background setting? Or did you even worry about that? Were you just telling these characters stories?
I would say I'm telling the characters stories, and the technology or, you know, other elements of their life at the time, I mean, they have to be part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
They have to do double duty. And it's interesting you mentioned the telephone, because, you know, rotary phones.
Yeah.
There was a scene, and in fact, you know, in the US, by the late 1980s, we already had the push button phones, but that was not the case in Chile. And I was there then, so I actually saw that people had rotary phones. Well, there's a scene in Surviving Santiago. Tina has gone to visit her father in Chile, and things have not gone well. And she wants to call her mother to have her mother send her a plane ticket to come home. And so she pulls you know, they have a rotary phone. Unfortunately, her home phone number has a lot of 8s and 9s in it. And she's trying to make this call. And because it takes so long with the rotary phone, she gets caught.
Wow. Yeah, I forgot that had to go all the way around and you had to wait and then do the next number. Yeah, so that's a great detail to put in there to show readers what it was like to use a rotary phone, but it's a tense moment in the plot.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Wow. Do you think you were able to write these stories so well because you were so familiar with the culture and with these people? Would it be possible for a writer who wasn't as familiar as you to have been able to write these stories?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that you can do a lot of research.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly I had the advantage of being able to live in Chile and interview people and live with a family, so that, you know, in a house rather than a hotel. So I could, and take public buses and, you know, I knew what life was like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, of course, that's not a luxury you have if you're writing about ancient Rome
True.
or even World War One.
Yeah.
So, you know, people do have to do research. And I think, you know, the later you are, the easier it is to do things like, you know, watch movies,
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
interview people who lived through those times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But even so, if you're going to be writing, say, about the 19th century, your work rests on the literature that has come before you. So read a lot of books that, you know, were written at the time, and historical fiction that was written afterwards that rests on those books, or movies that are set during those periods. And they can give you a flavor of the life, even if you can't experience it yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, and reading books that were written at a time at that time is a great tip because you get a sense of how people spoke back then, how they wrote, the cadence of their sentences, which is different from the way we often speak today. So that is, you know, even if your character is not going to be dealing with whatever the author of that is, you know, historical book is involved in, just getting a sense of that time period through those works of literature is a great idea.
Right. And also seeing movies. I was on a
Mm-hmm.
discussion. There's for historical writers of historical fiction, if you're on Twitter, there's a great series called HF Chit Chat. And we were talking about researching 19th century and earlier. And I gave the example of a movie called Peterloo, which is about a massacre in 1819 in Manchester, England, where the people were demanding democratic representation because they were being taken advantage of by the rich of the town.
Hmm.
And it shows, and it's based on research. Now, sometimes you watch movies and they're based on very slender research, but you know, this one got very good reviews for the quality of its research and presentation. And so you could see the houses and what they looked like and the clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, while you read, along with reading books, I think watching movies set during this period is a really good idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Now, your young adult novel, Rogue, features an eighth grade girl with Asperger's syndrome. Can you tell us a little bit about about this book and what inspired you to write it?
Okay, in around the time that I had started writing Gringolandia, I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And I was diagnosed as an adult, well into adulthood, I may add. Um, and it answered a lot of questions about the difficulties that I faced as a child. Things like having difficulty making friends and following rules. I didn't want to get in trouble, but I always managed to miss some social cue or some process or procedure and getting myself into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And I was often left out of other kids' social activities, which to some extent contributed to my becoming a writer because I became a very good observer. I was always on the outside looking in.
Mm-hmm.
But I also was on the outside wishing I could be there. And that, you know, when I was diagnosed and realized that that was sort of the cause of my struggles growing up and even, you know, older in school and in the workplace, I wanted to write a book for somebody, for kids like me, so that they could know that they aren't alone and that, you know, there are possibilities. So when I was done with Gringolandia, I decided to write a book based on, which really started with an incident that happened to me when I was in seventh grade. And Kiara's in 8th grade when it happens to her. But I wanted to be popular. So I thought that I could be in the popular crowd by sitting at the popular girls' table in the cafeteria. And well, that wasn't the way to do it. And they quickly showed me that by taking my tray and pushing it onto the floor, which happened to Kiara. In my case, I just stood there and cried, and all the kids laughed at me. Kiara picked up the tray and slammed it in the girl's face. And she wanted to be popular and she wanted to have a friend. The problem with slamming the tray in the girl's face, while it was gratifying, I wish I had done it too, was that she got kicked out of school. That made it even harder for her to make friends because there was no school and no kids. And then when this boy, who's a year and a half younger than she is, and his family move in around the corner, he's like her only chance to have a friend. And she will do anything to keep Chad and his little brother Brandon as her friends, including get involved in some very bad business that his family's involved with. Mm-hmm. So that was, that was really the starting point, was my own experience. But then, I took it in a completely different direction after the what if. What if Chad was my last chance to make a friend? And in fact, the situation that Chad got into was also something that happened to me in high school, which was that I let some popular kids get me into a bad business and basically use me. And then when I found out, I had to make a decision, a tough decision as to whether to continue to do it and have these people as my friends or tell them to get lost, because I didn't want to get in any trouble. And also because I realized it was only at that point that I realized they were using me all along. Mm-hmm. But it took like 6 months for me to realize. And if I'd gotten caught, I would have gone to jail.
So this is a deeply personal novel in a lot of ways, but I think a lot of writers have to make decisions like you did when they're basing something off of something that happened in their life.
Yeah.
You also need to have it serve the story that you want to tell. So you might need to change some details or have the character do some things that you didn't do or maybe wished you had, but
right,
but didn't. How hard is that to deviate from your personal story and sort of put yourself in the mind of the character you've created and let it be her story?
That is not hard for me to do. Mm-hmm. In large part because until my diagnosis, I was really trying to avoid revealing anything of myself in my stories, because it was such a painful experience that I didn't even want to think about it. Mm-hmm. So I would put myself into the shoes of my characters. And it was kind of a way of avoiding looking at myself and confronting who I was as a teenager, and what led me to write the kinds of things that I do today. Because even though I'd avoided putting myself in the story, the themes of being an outsider, the theme of being bullied, and of trying to end the bullying and do so in a way that preserved my dignity and sense of fairness and justice, was very important to me. So, in a sense, Gringolandia and Surviving Santiago are stories about a family surviving a country that is a bully, mm-hmm. a regime that is a bully. Mm-hmm. And I was attracted to that theme, even though it was not my story. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With Rogue, it was really my story. And the bullying was a lot more personal.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now, in my future work, I have one in which it's both personal bullying, because it's also a character who's on the autism spectrum, but he's growing up in a totalitarian society.
Wow. Wow.
So I'm really wanted to combine the two because history is my obsession.
Mm-hmm.
And I also wanted to have a character like me, again, write a character on the autism spectrum. Because I think it's really important for kids like me to know, to see themselves, and also to know that, as Kiara does when she reads a book by Temple Grandin, that if Temple Grandin had written this book, then she must have turned out all right.
Mm-hmm.
And to see these kids survive and thrive in the pages of the story.
Right, right. Well, you also work as a sensitivity reader for authors who are writing neurodiverse characters in their stories. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, I started out, I mean, I was very concerned when I wrote Rogue and when it came out. There were people who compared it to books that had already come out with autistic protagonists, and that were written by outsiders and were not particularly authentic.
Mm-hmm.
And they compared Rogue to those, and they said that, well, Kiara wasn't like, you know, X character in X award-winning book with an autistic protagonist that, you know, was not really my experience, and also contained some stereotypes and tropes that were somewhat harmful to people on the autism spectrum. So, you know, I saw these books become part of the canon, and that canon written by outsiders excluded us. Just as, unfortunately, there's a couple of autism organizations that also that exclude us. Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, a well-known slogan in the disability community: nothing about us without us. So I made a fuss. And as a result of making a fuss, I noticed that, you know, publishers came to understand the problems of inauthentic representation and harmful tropes. Mm-hmm. And while those unfortunately still exist, I think there's a lot less because publishers come to us looking for a sensitivity read for, you know, to mm-hmm. make sure that this character is authentic, is true to life, and that the book does not contain harmful tropes because the person writing it is an outsider that does not understand our experience. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And generally what I found is that publishers, and they've been really wonderful. I love the publishers I've worked with. I've had great experiences with every single one of them. Is that they're not, at this point, the autistic character they have me read for is a secondary character. They're not asking, or they're not publishing books where non-autistic people are writing autistic characters, autistic main characters, and I really do appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it's both, you know, you're not necessarily going to understand our experience. Sure. And the other thing is, a non-autistic character is going to take an opportunity away from somebody who's from the community. And, you know, we face challenges in marketing books that other people may not face. And, you know, but it's important that publishers work with autistic authors because our books are from the heart. And they're our lives, and they're real. Mm-hmm.
Right. So would your advice be to anybody listening who might be thinking of writing a book that has a autistic character, if they themselves are not autistic, would you suggest that they not do that? Or can they have a close relationship with someone who's autistic, like a child or a sibling? Is that okay? Where sort of would you, and this is your opinion, I'm just asking you to state here, where would you draw the line?
I think that, to have, there are a lot of autistic writers now who are
Mm-hmm.
writing wonderful books.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if it's a protagonist, um, I think that we should be the ones writing them
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that Black authors should write Black protagonists
Mm-hmm.
and Indigenous authors, Indigenous protagonists. But
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean erasing the character from the book. It means that the character's a secondary character.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if that character was a secondary character, it's a good idea for them to have someone like you as a sensitivity reader go through the manuscript and make sure that character is portrayed authentically. Is that a good
Yes.
idea? Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
And you had written on your blog an article about the difference between a sensitivity reader and an expert reader. These are two different things. Can you talk a little bit about that, the difference?
Well, a sensitivity reader is, in a way, it's kind of an expert reader.
Mm-hmm.
It's a person who shares a marginalization, and the expertise is on the emotional experience or the personal experience of that marginalization. Other kinds of expert readers may be experts in a language, experts, I mean, we talk about historical fiction,
Mm-hmm.
have a professor who has researched that period look at the book,
Mm-hmm.
or a medical drama, have a doctor
Mm-hmm.
with that expertise.
Right.
So with my next historical novel that takes place in Czechoslovakia in 1969, I've had sensitivity readers, including sensitivity readers for autism, because mine's not the only experience.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a gay character. So I had a sensitivity reader, somebody who grew up during that time period, and I'm still going to get another sensitivity reader who grew up, although not in the same time period, is from that same part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
To know that because the experience of being gay in the United States is different from the experience of being gay in, say, Germany or Czechoslovakia at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But an expert reader that I'm going to use is somebody who knows about life in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and 1969 when this book takes place.
Mm-hmm.
And is also a translator from Czech. So that the language and the use of Czech terms and honorifics and, is correct as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm. And there's, you can expect to pay a fee for these services.
Oh, yes.
So what would be sort of a standard ballpark fee for a sensitivity reader? Do they charge by the page, or how do they usually charge?
I usually charge, the beginning rate or the base rate is generally $250.
Mm-hmm.
And it can go up from there depending on how important that character is to the story. Mm-hmm. And how long the story is. I mean, obviously, if you have to read a book that's a manuscript that's 100,000 words, will cost more than one that's 50,000 words, or a picture book text. Mm-hmm. Typically with picture books, I'm looking at both the text and illustration, because some of the issues I've found have not been with the text, it's been with the illustration.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then with an expert reader, do you also assume you're going to pay for their time as well?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. You will occasionally find, especially with university faculty members, that, they might offer their services for free because, they're earning a salary, and, this might be considered part of their community service if, say, they're looking for tenure or promotion. But otherwise, I'd say yes, you would need to pay.
Right. And just so people know who are listening, they are not editors. They're not looking at, you know, sort of your story arc or anything like that. They're reading either sensitivity or expert readers for a specific aspect in your book, whether it's the way the characters portrayed, the way the illustrations, if they are accurate, or an expert reader if they're reading for details of a specific culture. So it's not, you would want to do this in addition to having your manuscript, say, critiqued by a professional editor for story and character development and that kind of thing.
Right. They're not in, you know, they're not going to give you, you know, a general opinion on whether your story works, but they may need to read the whole story. And I did forget to say, as far as paying sensitivity readers, is that sometimes you can trade with someone. I mean, for, you know, this forthcoming novel, Torch, that's set in Czechoslovakia, I traded a sensitivity reader or sensitivity read with a Cuban writer who was, he had an autistic secondary character in a story. I also did some translation for him because his was only a 3-page short story. But he read all of my book because what he was looking for, what I was looking for him to evaluate, even though he didn't grow up in Czechoslovakia, he was also a survivor of totalitarianism. And a very similar, I mean, it was the same political system. He also studied, went to the studied at the university level elsewhere in Eastern Europe. He was in East Germany. So there are other ways that people can serve as sensitivity readers, and also the idea of trading as opposed to exchanging money.
Great, great. Well, let me get to a few more of the questions here. We have a lot of really great questions. So one question here, I am both a writer and an editor. I had an author use Latinx to describe a character, and I did some searching to see if this would be the right term to use in a novel when the reader already knows the gender of the character, and got a lot of pushback. So do you know what the correct term is now? Latino, Latina, Latinx? Is there a preference as to what you should use?
I think we're trying to get away, and this is something, because I'm also a translator, is that within the translation community, we're talking about ways of addressing gender diversity in languages that are themselves gendered, as Spanish is. And one of the interesting things, Latinx is a purely US construction. If you go, say, to a translator or a writer in Argentina or Mexico who wants to go beyond the gender binary, they're talking about Latine, Latine. So I would say, as far as Latino, Latina, Latinx, you know, these are really not set in stone at this point.
So just sort of make your best.
Yeah, and it's a tough situation, because what's going to end up happening is it's going to date your book.
I know.
And, yeah. And it's, you know, I know even with Gringolandia and Surviving Santiago that, you know, I mean, they're historical novels, but they're also, you know, before the whole discussion of the gender of non-gendered language. But again, you know, set in Chile, where there was no discussion in 1986 or 1989 of language beyond the gender binary. And, there were other things like italicizing
Mm.
foreign languages, which nowadays most publishers do not.
Mm-hmm.
But, in those days, everybody did, even though it's now seen as treating the second language as a lesser or as less than because the process of italicizing.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Well, and I think that when you're writing historical fiction, you need to use the terms that were used at that time in that culture for the book to be authentic. Even if looking at it from our modern perspective, we say that's not how we say it now. Your book is existing within a different time period. So doesn't it have to be authentic for that time?
Yes. And that's kind of a tension that a writer of historical fiction faces.
Mm-hmm.
I know when I first started writing historical fiction, the big issue at the time was anachronistic feminism.
Hmm.
That protagonists in, say, the Middle Ages or the 19th century were a lot more feminist than they would have been in their society at the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you still have to deal with, in Gringolandia, I had to deal with, the ableist language that was used at the time. And, there are ableist terms because Danielle's father has a disability. And he refers to his disability in ableist language, in part because, he's angry.
Mm-hmm.
And he feels like this is, his disability has made him useless.
Mm-hmm.
But, so it's, in a sense, it's sort of reflecting on the ableism.
Mm-hmm.
But you still have, yeah.
Right. Can you give an example of ableist language for people who might not know that term?
Use of the word like crippled.
Mm. Right.
That's the one that's used a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and not a lot, but it is used. The thing is, one of the things you have to be careful of when you're using language that's ableist or otherwise problematical in a work of historical fiction is not to overuse it.
Right.
Use it once or twice, but don't hit the reader over the head with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that is a conundrum a lot of writers face when they are writing historical fiction, because they're much more sensitive from their modern perspective of what those words sound like and represent. But like I said, the book does not take place now. It takes place at a previous time.
Right.
So Melva asked, for those authors who are trying to have a mix of cultures represented by the characters, how do you share a phrase in another language and still have it understood in English? So yes, if you're using foreign words in your book, either in dialogue or in some other way, is it important to use them in a way so that a character who only speaks English, or a reader who only speaks English, can understand within the context?
I think it's important to have context clues.
Mm-hmm.
Not to repeat by defining the word, although you can get away with doing that once or twice.
Mm-hmm.
But the best thing to do, and I will say that, and I'm going to throw out a writer who I think does an amazing job of using Spanish without defining it, but with context clues, and that's Pablo Cartaya. He's really the expert on that. So definitely, if you want a model for how to use, to drop expressions in different languages into a book in a natural way, so that the whole writing just sings and does not slow down with defining what the character just said. His books are really good for that.
Great. And can you say his name again in case people missed that?
Pablo Cartaya, Cartaya.
Great, great. Thank you. Michelle says she has a middle grade historical fiction that takes place in Belgium with a dual point of view, one from a Belgian boy and one from an American girl. When the Belgian boy uses French in his dialogue, she does not italicize the French word. But when the American girl or her family use French, she does italicize because it feels foreign to them to say the word. Would you find this problematic, the use of italicized in that way?
No, I don't. Because I think that at that point, it is, it does show the, the fact that to that character, they're speaking a foreign language. In fact, in Torch, I use that because, I do that because one of the characters, I mean, they're speaking in Czech, and I don't, although the book's in English, I occasionally will put in a Czech word here and there, but not italicized. But when one of the characters speaks in German, I do italicize.
Okay, great, great. We've had a couple questions about recommendations you have for researching different time periods. One is Indiana in the mid-1800s. Let's just start with that. And I know you had talked about reading books, trying to watch movies set in that time period. I know also one job I had way back was researching old newspaper articles for historical events for a publisher I was working for at the time, which was fascinating. So I think, and we have all of that at our fingertips now with the internet, which is so wonderful. And do you have anything else that you can think of that would be good ways to sort of get a sense of the time period and location?
Historical societies and museums.
There you go.
Great, and not just print materials. Definitely look at artifacts and photos and illustrations.
Yeah, and historical societies are great, and small museums, they often are run by people who just know so much about the area history, and they just love to talk about it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I had that. I was in Portugal. My husband teaches a class at a graduate institute of the University of Lisbon. So we're in Portugal, except for this year, a couple months every year while he's teaching. And I was researching a book set in Portugal in the 1960s. And the characters needed to take a ferry from Lisbon over across the Tejo River to Almada. And there was a guy, I went to the museum of the town of Almada, which is south of Lisbon, and they were telling me there's this guy who collects everything as far as that over the years of the different ferries that went from Lisbon all over to the southern bank of the river. And she put me in touch with him.
That's great.
Unfortunately, I didn't actually get in touch with him because the scene ended up getting written out.
Oh, too bad.
And that's one of the problems with writing historical fiction is if you interview somebody, you don't know if the book's ever going to get published, or if it does get published, if you end up losing that scene.
Yeah. But it's really fun to research anyway. At least you learn all sorts of great stuff. Do you think it's important, if possible, to visit the country you're setting your book in, if you're setting it somewhere other than where you live? Does that add to your ability to write about that country?
It does for me. I mean, I visited, you know, I've been in every country that, you know, where I have set a book,
Mhm.
except for a picture book that I have not yet been to the country because of the pandemic, but I intend to go
Right, right.
before I actually have it, you know, before it's actually completely finished.
Hmm. Hmm. If you are, as a writer, and you're going to another country to really get a sense of the culture, I imagine you don't want to experience it as a tourist. You want to try to experience it as a local as much as possible. Do you, and I know you spend a lot of time in these countries,
Right.
but do you have any advice for people who might only have 2 weeks to go somewhere, but they want to experience it as a local?
I would say, you know, go into the neighborhoods, take the public transportation. A great place to go always are historical museums.
Hmm. Hmm. Great.
But on the other hand, you know, there is one issue with traveling to other countries, and that is, I mean, it does involve a certain level of having money and privilege.
Right.
So I still think that you can write a book set in the past in a country, and you don't have to go, you know, again, I mean, you know, the 19th century, you can, you know, books, movies. There are movies set in countries around the world.
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean, we've all enjoyed, for instance, seeing Parasite,
Hmm.
but you know, there are a lot more movies set in other countries that we just need to get beyond. You know, a lot of people don't like watching movies with subtitles, but there's just a wealth of perspectives and, you know, information and flavor of a place that you can get from, you know, seeing films from that place, and that you don't. I mean, right now we can't go anywhere. So we travel through books, we travel through movies, you travel through Google, you know, Google Maps.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I read a historical novel that was set in Entebbe, Uganda. And I went to Google Maps and sort of followed the path of the characters in that book, which was really, you know, that sort of added to my experience of this book.
Hmm. Absolutely. Last question here from Susan. When writing historical fiction, do you cite sources? So when you're submitting this book to an editor, or if you were submitting it to an agent, would you cite your research with the manuscript?
Well, let's see. I did not when I looked for an agent for a torch. And we did not have, I mean, I didn't have the author's note yet, but I did send, I mean, with the package that went to the editor, I did have the books that I used and some of the movies that I used in researching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But, you know, you would definitely, you know, while you wouldn't have to have all of them necessarily for a work of fiction, as opposed to, say, a work of nonfiction, where I think they want a pretty comprehensive list,
Mm-hmm.
um, that you'll definitely need them for the author's note in the back matter.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you suggest a good author's note, even with fiction,
Oh,
historical
yes.
fiction.
Oh, you definitely need an author's note. If for nothing else, to tell the reader what is actually fiction and what is fact,
Mm-hmm.
and where you've taken liberties with the history, because the truth is, you know, pretty much all of us who write historical fiction have to take at least some liberty with the, the truth in the service of the story. If only in terms of making up characters that didn't exist at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for instance, in Gringolandia, I talked about the fact that all of my characters are fictional, except there are two that were mentioned that, you know, were really, that were real people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, That's great. Thank you. Great advice. There one more question, quick question popped in here that I want to make sure we get to. If you could remind Penny S., how do you find expert historians? And you had talked about, you know, certainly universities,
Mhm.
professors I think are great. I imagine if you go to historical societies, you will find expert historians there.
Right.
Anywhere else that you can suggest people look for expert readers for their books, especially as far as history is concerned?
One place you can look, I mean, once you know, when you read a book that's a source, is who wrote the book, and would they be willing to talk to you, and who are in their footnotes.
Mm, that is a great, and I imagine also the acknowledgments pages. Authors often
Right.
thank people who vetted the manuscript for them. So you can just be a little bit of a detective there, but you'll find some good names that way.
Right. Well, you have to be a detective anyway in acknowledgments, because if you're looking for an agent, it's really good to look at who the agent is of books that you like.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
Absolutely.
you already know how to do that kind of research.
There you
You
go.
were made for this.
Absolutely. Well, Lynn, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us all your time, for sharing so much about your experience and your process and your expertise. I really appreciate you being with us here tonight.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here. If any of you all have further questions you'd like to ask, you can contact me on my website.
Terrific. Thank you.
And if you don't hear from me, it's possible that the contact form got accidentally deleted, so contact me again.
Okay, great. And when we post this replay on our blog, we will have a link to Lynn's website right under the replay in case you didn't notice it as the slide was going by. So you can definitely find it there as well. And all of her books, I think you need to read every one of them. They're
Well,
fascinating.
thank you. And the other two are coming out. I have Torch coming out. That's the one that's set in Czechoslovakia in 1969. Three friends of a young man who dies in an act of protest, and they're now being pursued by the secret police
Wow.
and have to come together because they're either don't know each other or they're not friends with each other. They have to come together to survive.
Wow.
And the other one is Moonwalking, which is a historical novel for middle grade readers in verse, set in 1982. I'm writing it with Zetta Elliott. It's a unlikely friendship between a undiagnosed autistic white boy obsessed with punk rock music and an Afro-Latinx science geek by day and graffiti artist by night.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. That sounds great. And do you have pub dates on either of those when they're coming out?
I believe that Moonwalking is spring 22 and Torch is fall 22.
Excellent. Well,
And
I
then
can't wait.
I have some nonfiction projects to keep an eye out for the announcements.
All right. Can people, do you make these announcements like if people follow your blog or something like that, will they get announcements about these things?
Yes. Or you
Great.
can go on the books page because I'll add every announcement on the books page.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, wonderful. I can't wait.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you again. It's been
And
great.
have a great week and have a great conference this weekend.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. And we will see you next week on our next Kidlit Distancing Social. So you all have a good night. Bye.
Bye.